Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. Part 1 comes for free. You can listen to Part 2 by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. The decision to charge for the second half comes from our desire to maintain our independence.
He died in misery. I met him 2 days before Christmas, and I just went down really ostensibly to do an interview, but really just to see him, because an interview with Ian was never of much value because he said the same thing over and over in the same way. And he was almost like a child who wanted attention. And because of his height, 6'4", and big bearing and big voice, it kind of went that, bugger, But when you got past that, there was a kind of little child still there,
Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast, an Irish home for independent journalism with a global perspective. The prophetess Cassandra advised her fellow Trojans to reject the horse the Greeks had seemingly left behind as a gift, but was ignored. Our Cassandra Voices podcast offers cautionary tales and inspiring narratives to illuminate our own troubled times. We'll be putting out regular episodes reflecting the broad scope of our magazine's coverage over the last 6 years. Thanks to the Loafing Heroes and especially Bartholomew Ryan for the use of their track Rogoira from the 2019 album Meander Tales. Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. I'm your host, Frank Armstrong, for this episode. The music for this episode comes from the track Wonder by our Musician of the Month for February, Aoife Nuvrin and Catherine Finch. A few months ago, a friend rang to say he had been in touch with Ian Bailey. Of course, I knew the name of a man who seemed to have courted notoriety over the years, after charges were dropped against him for the 1996 murder in West Cork of Sophie Toscan du Plantier. I wondered whether I should be giving him further publicity, but curiosity got the better of me, and on December 13th last year I rang up Ian Bailey, who proved affable and keen to tell his side of the story. I knew he had a history of domestic violence, but found myself warming to him nonetheless. Perhaps I was being charmed by a murderer. I was hesitant about getting drawn too deeply into this whodunit, however, so I asked a colleague if he would be interested in conducting the interview. He agreed, and over Christmas watched and listened to numerous series and podcasts exploring the case. After further conversations, Bailey agreed to be interviewed. It was scheduled for the Maritime Hotel in Bantry, West Cork on Saturday 27th of January. Coincidentally, his birthday. Car and accommodation were duly booked. On January 16th, in the middle of the cold snap, I sent him a message on WhatsApp saying, "Hopefully you're surviving the cold." He replied in characteristic fashion, "Electric blanket, long johns, 2 duvets and a bearskin. My recent dalliance with mortality has brought some things into clearer focus." Then on January 21st, news broke that Ian Bailey had died of a heart attack. So that was it, or was it? For a few days the case gnawed away at me. I felt compelled to pursue it further. A few years ago, I had met the renowned director and writer Jim Sheridan to discuss the housing crisis. Separately, he had become one of the most outspoken critics of the way in which Sophie's case has been handled, including the trial of Ian Bailey in France, where he was found guilty in absentia. My recent conversation with Jim has changed how I feel about this case. I can now see why solving the riddle could represent an important catharsis for Ireland, allowing us to explore our prejudices, including renewed anti-English sentiment after Brexit and the tribal hurt that lingers in the wake of the famine, and also an apparent desperation at a political level to please new masters in Europe. Perhaps we should consider whether it could ever be right to treat someone, anyone, as we have treated Ian Bailey, given the DPP's decision that there was insufficient evidence even to proceed to trial, and no compelling evidence has emerged in the interim. The fact that Ian Bailey mistreated his partner is immaterial to whether he murdered Sophie, a woman he did not or barely knew. Jim Sheridan needs little introduction. Film has been the most important art form of the 20th century, and his films, which gained both critical acclaim and global audiences that include My Left Foot, In the Name of the Father, and In America, have helped define the Irish national character. The interest he has taken in the case of Sophie Toscan du Plantier strongly suggests that there is something going on here that we should examine closely and perhaps revisit our opinions and prejudices. Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Jim Sheridan, the award-winning director and writer and man of many parts, who has agreed to talk mainly about the Sophie du Plantier case, which has been termed the Ian Bailey case. And first of all, and I'll refer to it henceforth as the Sophie du Plantier case. Jim, firstly, what made you interested in the case?
Pretty weird. I was just coming from Cannes for the first Fascinating Film Festival 11 years ago. I'd always been known of the case and was interested, but that trip started me thinking, because I was talking to Maurice Caesar, who did the music for In America and In the Name of the Father and The Boxer and Get Rich or Die Trying with Gavin Friday. And he was starting the Fascinating Film Festival. And I said to him, "Are you aware that it's on the same weekend as Cannes?" And Maurice was like, "Oh, yeah, what's Cannes?" And I'm like, "Oh, hey, Maurice, it's the biggest film festival in the world, but I'm supposed to go there." But and it turned out I could only come on a Saturday, and I had to get a flight from Cannes to Dublin to Cork, and drive from Cork to Skull. And while I was doing that, I was thinking, it's taking me longer to do this than it is to get to Los Angeles. And I was kind of then thinking, why did Sophie do this journey for a couple of days? Just come for 3 days and on her own, if you believe that. And what was going on? And that started me thinking about the case. And a namesake of mine, Mick Sheridan, had kind of been involved in it and was absolutely convinced Bailey did it and wrote a book to that effect. And I just started thinking about it. And then Donald McIntyre became involved, and kind of Ian Bailey suggested he contact me because I must have met Bailey or approached him. And so myself and Donald started working on it, and we approached the BBC, and they said they wanted to do it, but the money was so small. I went to Netflix to try and do it and didn't get anywhere there, and ended up with Sky. But if you ask me what's the compulsion, I think it comes out of my grandmother, who was a woman who had 10 children, and on the 11th child, she died giving birth to her. And that woman was my mother. And so I always felt this big feeling about this woman whose death brought my existence into place. And I then started kind of studying stuff about pre-birth and the womb, and what is our experience, and what's it like as a fetus, and do you even know where you are? And what actually happens is you start to try and identify your space, and you rub your fingers and thumbs off the amniotic fluid, and the movement of your hands in that regard produce a digital identity, which since the dawn of time people call fingerprints. And I had this weird thing that although my birthday was celebrated, it kind of got confused whether I was born on the 5th or 6th of February, because the baptismal cert said the 5th and the birth cert said the 6th. And my mother spoiled me because I was like the first child. And I think she went through into kind of exorcism herself, getting pregnant, because, obviously she was thinking of her own mother. And for her whole life, she had blamed herself for killing our mother. And I never remember her celebrating her birthday. And I wrote a movie called Into the West about her. And in that, the kid has never met his mother. And that was my mother. That's Ossie in the movie. And I didn't know it was my mother until I was making the movie. And so I began to become very concerned with the unconscious and the way it drives us narratively. And I began to realize as I was making the Bailey doc that it was something about, it started out as trying to figure out who killed Sophie and get justice for her. And then it changed gradually into getting justice for Ian Bailey, and really being propelled by this kind of feeling for the unjustly accused, of which my mother was the first, blaming herself for killing our mother. So all of these movies, In the Name of the Father and the Sophie, are a method, or they're like a psychological test to release my mother from her pain in some way. Now, I know that's a long answer.
Well, that is a very unexpected and fascinating response to reveal these internal dynamics. But obviously, when you get into this, it's a very confrontational exercise, because a lot of people are invested in the other side of the story and see things in terms of, justice for Sophie as being the incarceration of Ian Bailey. Can you understand why people believe Ian Bailey did it?
Yeah. Well, Jesus said, "Let you be without sin, cast the first stone." And the first stone cast in this story was the stone that beat Sophie to death, mirroring the first original crime of murder when Cain killed Abel. And Cain killed Abel because he was jealous, and his sacrifice was acceptable to the Lord. And after Cain killed Abel, the Lord Yahweh marked him with the mark of Cain, which everybody in the world thinks means you're a murderer. But that's not the significance of the mark. The significance of the mark is that God, or Yahweh, said, "Do not touch this man, because revenge will only produce revenge." And it's a circle that never ends. So Cain was marked in order not to be damaged, in order to end the cycle of violence. So you need to be very certain of your ground if you're going to throw the first stone. And the murder of Sophie resembles nothing as much as a stoning in, basically, I would say, maybe certain cultures, where the woman is stoned to death for a crime, usually a sexual crime. And it makes no sense to me on any level that a man wandered up there in the hills wearing a big black coat, got rejected, didn't sexually attack the person who rejected him, and beat them on the back of the head with a rock, which is impossible. if the person is standing in a fight, which the police say he lost a head and engaged in a rage. It's not the murder of a rage. So in that valley where Sophie lived, in 1845, there were probably 27 hamlets. In 1848, there were probably none. So the tribal memory of West Cork is of a disastrous famine that was like COVID, but 10 times worse. And the effect on the mentality of the population was devastating. And Fisher was the agent for the 27 tenants at will. And he wasn't liked because he would evict you if you didn't go to the correct school or skull, which is what the town is named after. And he was despised. But the weird thing was his landlord, his boss, the landlord, was quite liked. His name was Bailey. So it's almost like the Sophie murder in its appearance mirrors the events of the famine with a body left exposed. And I think it hit a tribal memory of shame and devastation, and somebody had to be responsible. And who's responsible for the famine? It's not the potatoes, it's not a blight, it's the English. And whether they were or not, to name an Englishman was almost like perfect, as they say in darts, 180. Now, the Englishman they named was very eccentric, and he had like a sergeant major accent, and he used words and phrases in a very ironic and sarcastic way, almost like a military man. And the only way you can understand sarcasm and irony is in a power structure where even though somebody is saying something, you understand it doesn't mean what it says. For instance, would be the royal family or the queen saying to the servants, I love your shoes this morning, which means he hasn't polished them. But the servant is so enthralled in the power structure, he knows exactly that the compliment is the opposite. That produces a dissociation with people in the way we speak and act. And Bailey was English perfection in sarcasm and irony.
What you are listening to has taken time and resources to prepare. It is a collaboration of committed journalists. Please, if you can, share, subscribe, or support this podcast in whatever way you can.
So when he's first told that he's going to be sacked, like anybody, he's angry. And like anybody, he's trying to rationalize it. And he asks why. And they say, well, people are saying you're the killer. At which point Bailey is probably the only journalist who's really pointing the finger at France, at the husband, at Toscan du Plantier. Correctly or incorrectly, we don't know. Probably incorrectly, but we leave that aside. But he's then an editor who's firing him, says to him, people are saying you did it. And he says, of course I did it to get a good story, which actually means nothing like I killed her. It means if my objective was to write stories about the murder, and that's the reason I killed her, it's not working, is it? I'm being fired. That's what it means. But that woman took this sentence to mean the opposite. And she told her editor, Mac Cooper. And I doubt very much Mac Cooper thought that that was an admission of guilt. But it was turned into that, just like every other supposed admission of guilt. And if somebody is saying, I'll give you an example, and it breaks my heart to say this, and I don't want to impinge anything to it. I really have a soft spot for the son of Sophie and his pain and his pursuit of justice, which has been heroic. But he was on the late on a week or so ago, and he said Bailey burned his coat on Christmas Day. But even the slightest perusal of the facts shows you that on the Christmas Day, Bailey was on a Christmas swim, which is recorded, the only piece of evidence, video evidence we have. Now the police are saying they're going to trawl through 20 hours of video footage to see if he met Sophie. Well, on Christmas Day, he was standing in full view of every single person in Skull, reciting poetry, waving his hands about. And the person who made that video, a year later, said that when she finished speaking to him, he took his hands out of his pockets and she noticed the scratches. Well, I'm sorry to say that his hands were out of his pockets for the entire Christmas swim video. He doesn't seem to have any noticeable scratches, and he doesn't seem to have any on his head. So he couldn't, if he burnt the coat, he had to burn it after that video. It's ridiculous. And it's ridiculous that he burnt it on Stevens's Day, because the police took it on the 10th of February, and there's a photograph of it in a clear plastic wrapping that they took it away. So the scratches have been invented. The confessions are nonsense. And the burning of the coat is nonsense. And the bleaching of the coat on Christmas Eve is nonsense. It's proof. I can say this and you can put it out without fear. Ariana Borina lied when she said Bailey bleached his coat in a bucket in a shower. It wouldn't fit in the bucket. There's no shower in the house. And she made a police statement to the opposite, that she couldn't recognize the clothes in the bath. So have the police gone to her and said, Ariane, you shouldn't be saying this? And have they gone back to the Sun and say, look, don't be exposing, you're being exposed to problems for yourself because we took the coat? No, why not? Why have they not gone and corrected this, seeing that there's a media storm about going in and dragging his stuff out of the house? So, I mean, you can obviously tell that I'm slightly angry, and I'm angry, I suppose, God bless the French family. They believe what they've been told, but that seems the most heinous of situations to me. And it's not a shame on West Cork, this murder, like Micheál Martin said. It's a shame on the Attorney General and the police for sending the file to France over the head of the Director of Public Prosecutions, who's creates a civil situation in law where before you can be charged, the DPP have to allow it. So you're not charged. So, okay, let's just send it to France where they won't allow Marie Farrell to appear and say that she lied. Like, that's the situation we're dealing with. And nobody owns up to it. And we have Francois Macron coming on the television speaking about this murder. Like, has he nothing better to do? I know the French family probably are trying at their hardest, highest level, but there needs to be an intake of breath now and stop all this. It's just too insane.
But from the sounds of things, you're not stopping about this. You're going to pursue it with a further documentary and maybe a drama. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm only pursuing it insofar as I'm trying to find out what actually happened, you know? I have nothing but admiration for the unarmed police, especially the ones murdered in the line of duty, who gave their lives to protect us and whose names should be inscribed on a mural about equal to the size of the hunger strikers and put beside it so that we begin to understand the relative values of the country, you know? So I'm not out to, I don't know how it came about that the police thought Bailey did it and pursued it with such zealotry. That's a mystery to me. And I feel now like a little bit like, do I need this in my life, you know? Because now that Ian's gone, I have people calling me who tortured him in his life and want to engage with me now. And I'm thinking, do I need this? Do I need the torture Ian endured? Even look, let's say in 1,000,000 to 1 chance, I'm a tick, an idiot, and all the facts that I've looked at, I'm wrong, and somehow Ian Bailey may have murdered Sophie. Well, guess what? Like 27 years of torture, unable to move, unable to leave, branded a murderer without charge. That's a shame on Ireland. Yeah, it's a shame on the legal system. It's not a shame on West Cork. Leave West Cork out of it. It's like the thing that located this murder in West Cork was one line in the New Yorker in New York, in that magazine, where they said there's a devil in the hills, which meant the murderer had to be in West Cork because of a ludicrous idea that only a local could know where she lived. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, none of the locals know where she lived. About 4 of them do. The Helens who looked after the house, Leo Bulger, 1 or 2 others. But with after that, nobody knew. Maybe Bailey knew. Definitely the neighbours knew. Everybody in France knew. So the idea that only Irish people knew where she lived, that's a joke. And she called up everybody in France to go with her, according to what we hear. So they all knew she was there. So there's an overwhelming evidence that much more French people knew where she was than Irish.
To listen to the remainder of this podcast and access bonus material into the future, please consider supporting us with a subscription.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Cassandra Voices is a multimedia project that seeks to highlight independent voices and inspire original thinking with stories from Ireland and around the world. Go to CassandraVoices.com online to read more and look out for more episodes from us in future. Your attention and your support are crucial. Thank you.